Somewhere in Connecticut, 1945, a woman stands at the edge of her garden, arms crossed, staring at a patch of overgrown grass. She has been waiting 3 weeks for the hired plowman to show up. 3 weeks. He never came. Most people would have waited longer. Called again. Apologized for the inconvenience. But Ruth Stout was not most people. She looked at the grass, looked at the bag of seed potatoes sitting by the door, and made a decision that the entire agricultural industry would spend the next 70 years pretending never happened. She didn't plow. She didn't dig. She didn't turn a single inch of soil. She placed the seed potatoes directly onto the grass, covered them with a thick layer of hay, and walked back inside to make tea. 4 months later, she lifted that hay with her bare hands and found more potatoes than her neighbors had pulled from their carefully tilled, fertilized, chemically treated beds. Clean potatoes, no mud, no digging, no back pain. Total cost, nearly $0. Now here is the question nobody in a $12 billion garden tool industry wants you to ask. If this works, and it has been proven to work for 80 years across thousands of gardens on every continent, why does nobody teach this in schools? Why does no gardening magazine put it on the cover? And why did it take you until today, right now, watching this video, to hear her name for the first time? The answer is not complicated, but it is uncomfortable. And once you understand it, you will never look at a shovel the same way again. Ruth Stout was born in 1884 in Stolp, Kansas, the third of 9 children in a family that valued independent thinking above almost everything else. Her brother Rex Stout would go on to become one of America's most celebrated mystery writers. But Ruth, quieter in fame, louder in conviction, would leave a different kind of legacy. Not in fiction, in dirt, or more precisely in the deliberate absence of digging through it. She did not come to gardening young. She did not grow up dreaming of harvests or studying soil composition in university classrooms. She came to it the way most genuinely revolutionary ideas arrive. Sideways, uninvited, born out of frustration rather than inspiration. By the time she started experimenting with her no-dig method in 1945, Ruth was 61 years old. 61. An age when most people are told to slow down, to leave the heavy work to younger hands, to stop trying new things. She ignored all of that completely. The plowman who never showed up did not derail her garden. He accidentally handed her 80 years of agricultural history. What she discovered in those first seasons was not just a gardening trick, it was a philosophy. She began covering every inch of her Connecticut garden with a permanent, deep layer of mulch. Hay, straw, leaves, whatever organic material she could find. And she never removed it, never tilled beneath it, never let the soil surface see direct sunlight again. Year after year, the ground beneath that mulch grew darker, richer, and more alive. The work got lighter. The harvest got heavier. She wrote about it with the kind of sharp, impatient humor that made her impossible to dismiss. Her 1961 book, Gardening Without Work, was not titled as a suggestion. It was titled as a provocation, a direct challenge to every seed catalog, every extension office pamphlet, every television gardening program that insisted good gardens required suffering. She was saying openly and without apology that they were wrong, that the whole system was built backwards, that the effort modern gardeners were pouring into their soil was not feeding their plants. It was destroying the very foundation their plants depended on. The gardening establishment did not celebrate her. They did not debate her. They did something far more effective. They simply looked away. She kept gardening anyway, all the way to the age of 96, working her beds, writing letters, answering questions from the readers who had found her book and could not believe what they were reading was real. She died in 1980, still tending her Connecticut soil, still covered in hay rather than chemical fertilizer, still refusing to pick up a plow. And the science, the hard, peer-reviewed, university laboratory science, has spent the last 4 decades slowly, quietly proving that everything she observed was exactly right. But to understand why, we first need to talk about money, a very specific, very large amount of money, and the industry that has every reason in the world to make sure you never connect these dots. Let's talk about numbers, because numbers have a way of making things very clear very fast. The global fertilizer industry was valued at $197 billion in 2022. Not million, billion, and it is projected to cross $230 billion by 2030, growing steadily year after year, driven almost entirely by the assumption that soil cannot feed plants without chemical intervention. That assumption is the product they are selling, not the fertilizer itself, the assumption. The fertilizer is just what you buy once the assumption takes hold. The garden tool industry adds another $12 billion on top of that. Tillers, cultivators, plows, aerators, dethatchers, machines designed to do one thing at their core, which is to break open the ground so you can add the products that the $197 billion industry is selling. The two markets do not compete. They complete each other. Every time you buy a tiller, you are also committing to buying the amendments that tilling makes necessary. It is a closed loop, and it has been spinning for decades. Then add the pesticide and herbicide market, another $84 billion globally, because bare, tilled soil is an open invitation to weeds and pest pressure, which then requires additional chemical management, which requires additional equipment to apply, which generates additional revenue across every segment of the chain simultaneously. Nearly $300 billion per year, built on the premise that growing food is complicated, expensive, and requires professional-grade intervention at every stage. Now consider what Ruth Stout's method costs. A bag of seed potatoes, perhaps $3 to $5, straw or hay, which in most rural areas can be sourced free from farmers who need to dispose of it, or purchased for $5 per bale, enough to cover 15 square meters. No fertilizer. No tiller rental at $60 to $80 per session. No pesticides because the mulch system suppresses both weeds and many soil-borne pests naturally. No soil amendments because the decomposing mulch becomes the amendment, season after season, rebuilding organic matter at a rate that commercial compost products sold at $20 to $40 per bag cannot match in long-term performance. The total investment for a serious potato bed using Ruth Stout's method, somewhere between $0 and $15, against a conventional approach that runs $50 to $100 per season before you count your labor hours. That gap, that enormous, embarrassing gap, is not a secret buried in obscure academic journals. It has been demonstrated in backyard gardens across 6 continents for 80 years. And yet, if you walk into any garden center today, you will find an entire wall of synthetic fertilizers, a row of gas-powered tillers, and a staff trained to sell you both before you reach the seed potatoes. This is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. There is no shadowy boardroom where executives decided to erase Ruth Stout from the curriculum. What happened is quieter than that, and in many ways more troubling. The publications that educate home gardeners are funded by advertising from the companies that sell gardening inputs. The television programs that teach weekend gardeners their technique are sponsored by tool manufacturers and fertilizer brands. The extension offices that advise smallholders are frequently staffed by graduates of agricultural programs whose research departments receive industry funding. Nobody issued a directive. The information simply flows in the direction of the money, the way water finds the lowest ground naturally without anyone having to force it. Ruth Stout had no advertising budget. Her books sold on word of mouth, passed between neighbors, left on community center shelves, mailed between strangers who had tried it and could not believe nobody else knew. It was the original underground gardening movement, running parallel to the official narrative for decades, never quite loud enough to threaten the $300 billion ecosystem surrounding it. Until now, because the science caught up, and what it found underneath that layer of straw is something that changes the entire conversation about what soil actually is, what it actually does, and why every time you drag a blade through it, you are paying a price you cannot see on any receipt. Before we go underground, we need to correct something. Something most people carry with them from childhood without ever questioning it, because nobody ever gave them a reason to. Ask almost anyone where a potato grows and they will tell you. Underground, deep underground, buried in dark, heavy soil, packed in tight, requiring a serious commitment of space and depth to develop properly. This is the mental image that drives the entire conventional potato growing system. The deep furrows, the hilling, the heavy clay beds, the dramatic digging at harvest time that leaves the garden looking like a construction site. The potato, in the popular imagination, is a creature of the deep earth. It is not. A potato is not a root vegetable in the botanical sense. What you are eating when you eat a potato is called a stolon, a lateral stem that grows horizontally outward from the base of the plant, swelling as it fills with stored starch. It is technically a modified stem, an underground branch that decided to become a food storage unit rather than a leaf. And this distinction matters enormously because stems do not behave like roots. They do not reach downward, searching for water through layers of compacted clay. They reach outward, horizontally, through whatever soft, dark, consistently moist medium surrounds them. Compacted soil is not a particularly hospitable medium for horizontal stem expansion. It resists. It compresses the developing tuber, limits its size, and introduces it to a wide variety of soil-dwelling organisms, wireworms, slugs, scab-causing bacteria, that conventional agriculture then responds to with fungicide seed treatments and soil pesticides, adding further cost and chemical load to a system that created the problem in the first place. Loose straw, on the other hand, offers no resistance at all. The developing stolon pushes outward through air pockets, through decomposing organic matter, through a medium that shifts and yields rather than compresses and fights. The tubers that form in a deep straw mulch are consistently larger, more uniform in shape, and, critically, completely clean at harvest. No soil embedded in the eyes. No scrubbing required. You lift the straw and the potatoes are simply lying there, as if someone arranged them for a photograph. The three conditions a potato tuber actually needs to develop properly are darkness, consistent moisture, and physical space to expand. 30 to 40 centimeters of straw mulch provides all three simultaneously at a level of precision that no amount of soil tilling and hilling can reliably replicate. The darkness is absolute. No light penetrates that depth of organic material, which means tubers never green up, never develop solanine, never become the mildly toxic disappointment that exposed potatoes turn into. The moisture is self-regulating. Straw is a remarkably effective insulating layer that reduces evaporation by 60 to 80% compared to bare soil, meaning the potato plant draws on a far more stable water supply throughout the season without requiring irrigation in all but the driest conditions. And the space is unlimited in the horizontal plane, which is exactly the direction stolons want to travel anyway. Ruth Stout did not know the word stolon in 1945. She was not reading botanical journals or consulting university extension researchers. She was standing in her garden in Connecticut, irritated about the plowman, and she made an intuitive leap that turned out to be scientifically precise in every meaningful way. The plant knew what it needed. She simply stopped putting obstacles in its path. But here is what neither Ruth Stout nor the botanical textbooks of her era fully understood. The most important thing happening in her garden was not above the straw, where the potato plants were leafing out in the summer sun. It was not even at the level where the tubers were quietly swelling through the loose organic matter. It was happening in the dark, undisturbed soil beneath, in a layer of biological activity so complex, so interconnected, and so devastatingly fragile that modern science needed electron microscopes and DNA sequencing to begin to describe it accurately. And every time you push a tiller blade into healthy ground, you are tearing through it like a blade through silk. There is a network beneath your feet right now that has no name in common language, because for most of human history, we had no idea it existed. It has been there for approximately 450 million years, predating land animals, predating flowering plants, predating almost every living system we consider fundamental to life on this planet. It runs through every healthy patch of soil on Earth, connecting plants to minerals, plants to water, and in ways that still astonish researchers who have spent decades studying nothing else. Plants to each other. It is called the mycorrhizal network, and it is the reason Ruth Stout's garden worked the way it did, even though she never once used that word. Mycorrhizal fungi are not the mushrooms you see above ground. They are the invisible infrastructure beneath them. Thread-thin filaments called hyphae, so fine that a single teaspoon of undisturbed forest soil contains an estimated 11 kilometers of them. They weave through the spaces between soil particles, through the surfaces of mineral grains, through the root cells of plants in a relationship so ancient and so intimate that approximately 90% of all land plant species on Earth cannot reach their full biological potential without it. The fungi extend the plant's reach into the soil by a factor of 100 or more, accessing phosphorus, nitrogen, zinc, and water molecules that the plant's own root system could never touch. In exchange, the plant feeds the fungi with sugars produced through photosynthesis, a transaction that has been running continuously, without interruption, since before the first dinosaur drew breath. A single gram of healthy, undisturbed soil contains between 100 million and 1 billion individual microbial organisms, representing thousands of species operating in relationships of extraordinary complexity. Bacteria that fix atmospheric nitrogen into plant-available forms, protozoa that consume bacteria and release nitrogen as waste at the exact moment plant roots are positioned to absorb it, nematodes that regulate bacterial populations with a precision no synthetic fertilizer schedule can replicate, and threading through all of it, the mycorrhizal network, the connective tissue that makes the entire system function as a single living entity rather than a collection of separate organisms competing for resources. This is what healthy soil actually is. Not a growing medium, not a substrate, a civilization. Now here is what happens when you drive a tiller blade through it. Research published in the journal Applied Soil Ecology found that a single pass of conventional tillage equipment reduces mycorrhizal fungal biomass by between 30 and 60%. Not gradually, immediately. The physical disruption severs hyphae across the entire tilled area, collapsing the network in the same way that cutting every road and power line in a city simultaneously would collapse its infrastructure. The soil does not die in the dramatic sense. Individual organisms survive, and the network begins rebuilding. But rebuilding takes time, months in optimal conditions. And in most conventional growing systems, the soil is tilled again before full recovery occurs, which means the network is perpetually operating at a fraction of its potential capacity, perpetually dependent on synthetic inputs to compensate for the biological services it can no longer provide on its own. A study from the University of Reading published in 2019 found that soil under long-term no-dig management contained microbial biomass levels 3 times higher than equivalent soil under conventional tillage. 3 times. The difference was not marginal, it was not within the range of experimental error. It was a fundamental, measurable, reproducible divergence in biological activity driven entirely by whether or not a blade had been regularly pushed through the ground. Charles Dowding, a market gardener in Somerset, England, has been running a direct side-by-side comparison of no-dig and conventional dig beds on the same property since 2013. Same seeds, same weather, same irrigation. The only variable is whether the soil is tilled each season. After more than a decade of data, his no-dig beds consistently outperform the dug beds in total yield, while requiring significantly less labor, less fertilizer input, and less intervention against pests and disease. His results have been replicated in home gardens across the United Kingdom, the United States, Australia, and Japan. The pattern holds regardless of climate, regardless of crop, regardless of starting soil quality. This is the moment in the video where I need you to stop and sit with something uncomfortable. Because if all of this is true, and it is true, it is documented, it is reproducible, then the standard advice that has been handed to home gardeners for the better part of a century, the advice to dig, to till, to turn the soil, to break it up and aerate it and work it into a fine tilth before planting, that advice is not just unhelpful, it is actively destructive. Every season of conventional tillage is a season of dismantling the exact biological infrastructure that makes growing food possible in the first place, then spending money on synthetic replacements for the services that infrastructure used to provide for free. You are not improving your soil when you till it. You are billing yourself for the damage. Ruth Stout figured this out in 1945 with nothing but a bag of seed potatoes, a pile of hay, and the absence of a plowman who never showed up. She did not have access to electron microscopes or DNA sequencing or peer-reviewed journals. She had observation, patience, and the willingness to trust what she saw in front of her rather than what she had been told to expect. And what she saw, season after season, was that the ground beneath her permanent mulch layer grew darker and richer and more alive with each passing year, without a single application of fertilizer, without a single pass of a tilling blade, without a single dollar spent on the inputs that the $197 billion fertilizer industry insists are non-negotiable requirements for productive soil. The science did not create her method. It simply arrived 70 years late to explain why it worked. And now that you understand the why, the real why, not the simplified version, you are ready to actually do this, step by step, with exact costs, exact measurements, and the specific details that determine whether your first season succeeds or quietly fails in ways that make you doubt the method rather than the execution. Let's make this real. Everything you have heard up to this point, the history, the science, the mycorrhizal networks, the $300 billion industry built on the assumption that you cannot do this without their products, all of it becomes either meaningful or meaningless, depending on what happens in the next 10 minutes of your life. Because knowledge that stays in your head and never reaches your hands is just entertainment. And Ruth Stout was not interested in entertaining people. She was interested in feeding them. So here is exactly what you do. Not approximately, exactly. The first thing you need is seed potatoes. Not the potatoes from the grocery store, which are frequently treated with sprout inhibitors that prevent them from chitting properly and are often bred for industrial growing conditions that have nothing to do with a home garden. You need certified seed potatoes from a garden center or agricultural supplier, which typically run between $3 and $8 for enough to plant a 10 square meter bed. If you already have potatoes from a previous season that have begun sprouting in your kitchen, those work perfectly. Cost at this stage, $3 to $8 or zero if you have sprouting potatoes on hand. Before planting, you want to chit your seed potatoes, a process of allowing the sprouts to develop to approximately 2 centimeters in length before they go into the ground. Set them in a single layer in a cool, bright location, not direct sunlight, not a dark cupboard, for 2 to 4 weeks before your last expected frost date. This gives the plant a developmental head start that translates to earlier emergence and stronger initial growth. The difference between chitted and unchitted seed potatoes in terms of emergence time is typically 7 to 14 days. In a short growing season, that window matters. Now choose your location. Potatoes need a minimum of 6 hours of direct sunlight per day. This is non-negotiable regardless of method. Everything else about the site is flexible. Slope, existing vegetation, soil type, previous use. None of it matters the way conventional advice suggests, because you are not going to be working with the soil directly. You are going to be working above it. Do not clear the grass. Do not pull the weeds. Do not remove any existing vegetation from the planting area. This is the instruction that causes the most hesitation in people encountering the Ruth Stout method for the first time, because it runs so directly against every gardening instinct that has been cultivated over a lifetime of conventional advice. Leave it. The existing vegetation will be suppressed by the mulch within 2 to 3 weeks and will then begin decomposing into additional organic matter beneath the straw layer, feeding the soil from below while the mulch feeds it from above. Place your chitted seed potatoes directly onto the existing ground surface, sprouts facing upward, spaced 30 centimeters apart in each direction. For a standard 10 square meter bed, you will use approximately 110 seed potatoes, which sounds like a large number until you calculate the yield. A well-managed Ruth Stout bed in good conditions produces between 3 and 5 kilograms of potatoes per plant, meaning that 10 square meter bed has the potential to yield between 300 and 500 kilograms of food from a $15 investment, without tilling, without fertilizing, without any of the inputs the conventional system tells you are essential. Now cover them. This step is where most first-season failures originate, and it is almost always the result of applying insufficient mulch depth. 30 centimeters is the minimum. 40 centimeters is better. If you look at your mulch layer and think it seems excessive, add more. The depth serves 3 simultaneous functions. It creates the absolute darkness the developing tubers require to avoid greening. It provides the insulating moisture retention layer that eliminates the need for regular irrigation in most climates. and it gives the lateral stolons the loose, resistance-free medium they need to expand to their full potential size. Compromise on depth, and you compromise on all three functions at once. The best mulch material is straw, the dried stems of cereal crops like wheat, oat, or barley after the grain has been harvested. It is distinct from hay, which is dried grass cut before seeding and which contains viable seeds that will germinate under your mulch and compete aggressively with your potato plants. This distinction is critical and worth repeating clearly. Straw, not hay. Straw is typically available from farm supply stores, agricultural markets, and directly from grain farmers who need to dispose of it after harvest. Cost ranges from zero, if you can arrange collection directly from a farmer, to approximately $5 per bale, with each bale covering roughly 3 to 4 square meters at the required depth. For a 10 square meter bed at 40 centimeter depth, budget for 3 to 4 bales. Total mulch cost, $0 to $20. Water the bed once after laying the mulch, thoroughly enough that moisture penetrates to the soil surface beneath. After this initial watering, the straw layer will regulate moisture independently in all but the most extreme drought conditions. In a typical temperate growing season with normal rainfall, you may not need to water again at all. The straw creates a microclimate beneath its surface, where temperature fluctuations are dampened, evaporation is suppressed, and the soil remains consistently moist at a depth that roots and stolons can access continuously. Approximately 2 to 3 weeks after planting, you will see the first green shoots pushing up through the straw surface. At this point, add a supplementary layer of 5 to 10 centimeters of additional straw around the emerging shoots. Not covering them, but building up the surrounding mulch to maintain depth as the lower layers begin to compress and decompose. This is the only active management the bed requires between planting and harvest. No weeding because the mulch prevents germination. No fertilizing because the decomposing organic matter is continuously releasing nutrients into the soil below. No hilling because the mulch performs that function permanently and automatically. Between 90 and 120 days after planting, depending on your variety, the foliage will begin to yellow and die back. This is the signal that harvest is ready, and this is the moment that justifies everything. The moment Ruth Stout described in her writing with a quiet satisfaction that reads, even decades later, like someone who knew exactly what they had figured out. You do not need a fork. You do not need a spade. You do not need to excavate anything. You reach down, take hold of the straw, and lift. Beneath it, resting on or just below the original soil surface, clean and smooth and entirely free of the mud and damage that conventional digging inevitably introduces, are your potatoes. You pick them up with your hands. You put them in a basket. The entire harvest of a 10 square meter bed, potentially hundreds of kilograms of food, can be completed by a single person in under 2 hours without bending more than a few degrees at the waist. Compare that to the conventional harvest method, which involves pushing a garden fork repeatedly through compacted soil, inevitably spearing a percentage of the crop, excavating each plant individually, shaking soil from tangled root systems, and spending 8 to 12 hours producing a harvest that arrives damaged, dirty, and exhausted. Ruth Stout called her method gardening without work. She was not being figurative. But before you go outside and start laying straw, there is something she warned about in her writing. A specific, predictable mistake that sends first-season no-dig gardeners back to conventional methods convinced that the system failed, when what actually failed was one single detail in the execution. And if you miss what I'm about to tell you, everything else we have discussed today becomes significantly less likely to work. Ruth Stout was honest in a way that most gardening writers are not. She did not present her method as a miracle. She did not promise that every first-season attempt would produce a record harvest, or that the transition from conventional growing to permanent mulch would be seamless and immediate. She understood that people coming from decades of tilling-based gardening were bringing with them a set of deeply ingrained habits, and that those habits, more than any failure of the method itself, were the most reliable predictor of a disappointing first season. So before you touch a single bale of straw, understand the mistakes that in no-dig experiments before they have a fair chance to prove themselves. The first and most common failure is insufficient mulch depth. This point was made in the previous section, but it bears repeating with more specificity because the consequences of getting it wrong are significant and not immediately obvious. When straw mulch is applied at 15 or 20 centimeters, rather than the required 30 to 40, light penetrates to the developing tubers. Potato tubers exposed to light, any light, even indirect light filtering through thin mulch, respond by producing chlorophyll, which turns them green and solanine, a glycoalkaloid compound that is mildly toxic in small amounts and seriously problematic in large ones. A green potato is not a failed potato in the dramatic sense, but it is a potato you cannot eat without removing significant portions of the flesh, and an entire bed of underprotected tubers represents a meaningful loss of yield and food safety. The fix is simple and absolute. Always apply more mulch than you think you need. If you are uncertain whether your layer is thick enough, add another 10 centimeters. Err consistently in the direction of excess. The second mistake, and this one catches people who are paying attention to depth but not to material, is using hay instead of straw. The difference in appearance between the two is subtle enough that they are frequently confused at agricultural markets, and the difference in consequence is severe enough to compromise an entire season. Hay is grass that has been cut and dried while still carrying its seed heads. Every bale of hay contains thousands of viable grass seeds distributed evenly through the material. When you lay hay over your potato bed and water it, you are not mulching your garden. You are planting a dense lawn directly on top of your crop. The grass germinates within the warm, moist microclimate beneath the surface layer and emerges competing aggressively with your potato plants for light, water, and soil nutrients. Managing that competition without disturbing the mulch layer is extremely difficult, and many first-season gardeners who encounter this problem assume the method is flawed rather than the material. Straw, the dried stems of cereal crops after grain harvest, contains no viable seeds. It is the correct material. When purchasing, ask specifically for cereal straw, and if possible, confirm the source crop. Wheat straw, oat straw, and barley straw are all appropriate. Hay in any form is not. The third limitation is one that Ruth Stout herself acknowledged, and it requires a degree of patience that runs counter to the immediate results culture of modern gardening content. The first season of a Ruth Stout bed is rarely the best season. The undisturbed soil beneath the mulch has not yet had time to develop the full biological activity that makes the system exceptional. The mycorrhizal networks are intact, which is already a significant advantage over tilled soil. But the organic matter levels, the worm population density, and the nutrient cycling capacity of the system all increase progressively over multiple seasons as the decomposing mulch continuously feeds the soil from above. Gardeners who try the method once, achieve a modest yield, and conclude that conventional tilling produced better results are almost always comparing their first no-dig season against their best conventional season, which may represent years of accumulated soil amendment. The fair comparison is second-year no-dig against second-year conventional, or third-year against third-year. By that point, the trajectory of the two systems has typically diverged so clearly that the comparison requires no further argument. The fourth challenge is practical rather than technical, and it disproportionately affects urban and suburban gardeners. Sourcing sufficient quantities of straw in a city is genuinely difficult. Garden centers sell straw in quantities suited to decorative use rather than deep agricultural mulching, and at prices that undermine the cost advantage of the method. If you are gardening in an urban environment without access to agricultural suppliers, there are viable alternatives that Ruth Stout herself used and endorsed. Autumn leaves collected and stockpiled from the previous fall can substitute for straw when applied at equivalent depth. Shredded cardboard, the plain, uncoated variety without colored inks, laid directly on the soil surface as a base layer before mulching suppresses existing vegetation effectively and decomposes into organic matter within a single season. Wood chip from municipal tree services, which is frequently available free to residents in many areas, functions well as a mulch material, though it should not be used in direct contact with seed potatoes as it can harbor fungal species that damage tubers. A combination of cardboard base plus leaf mulch plus whatever straw you can source represents a practical urban alternative that maintains the core principles of the method even when ideal materials are not fully accessible. What none of these alternatives fully replicate, at least in the first season, is the immediate biological richness of a well-established permanent straw mulch system. That richness builds, it compounds. It is the gardening equivalent of a savings account that pays increasing interest each year rather than a one-time transaction. People who abandon the method after one imperfect season are withdrawing their investment before the compounding begins. Ruth Stout understood this, which is why she kept writing, kept corresponding with readers, kept insisting gently but absolutely that the method required trust before it delivered proof. She had the advantage of having seen her own garden transform over decades, of having watched the soil beneath her Connecticut hay deepen and darken, and teem with life in a way that no bag of synthetic fertilizer had ever produced. She could ask her readers to trust the process because she had already lived through it herself. You have not lived through it yet, but you now understand, at a level of scientific and historical detail that Ruth Stout herself never had access to, exactly why the process works, exactly what is happening beneath the surface, and exactly what mistakes to avoid in order to give it a genuine chance to show you what it can do. Which means the only thing standing between you and a garden that feeds itself, improves itself, and asks almost nothing of you in return is the decision to begin. And that decision leads somewhere much larger than a potato harvest. There is a moment that every no-dig gardener describes, usually sometime in the second or third season, that has nothing to do with yield measurements or mycorrhizal biomass percentages or cost comparisons with conventional growing inputs. It is the moment they put their hands into the soil beneath the mulch and feel what it has become. Not the soil they started with. Compacted, pale, resistant. The kind of ground that pushes back against a trowel and breaks into hard, angular clods when disturbed. The soil they find after 2 or 3 years of permanent mulch cover is something categorically different. Dark, almost black. Loose to a depth that seems improbable given that nothing has ever been mechanically loosened. Smelling of forest floor rather than mineral dust. Moving with earthworms in numbers that seem almost theatrical, as if the ground itself has come alive in a way that the word alive barely begins to capture. That moment is not about potatoes. It is about something that is surprisingly difficult to articulate without sounding like you have wandered away from a gardening video and into a conversation about something else entirely. But Ruth Stout articulated it in her sharp and impatient way in the closing pages of Gardening Without Work, and it is worth sitting with what she was actually saying. She was saying that the relationship between a person and their soil does not have to be extractive, that the model of gardening as conquest, break the ground, force it into submission, overwhelm its deficiencies with chemical correction, harvest what you can before it recovers, is not the only available model, and arguably not a model at all in the sustainable sense, because it requires perpetual escalating intervention to maintain yields that a healthy biological system would produce automatically and indefinitely without assistance. She was saying that the alternative, working with the soil's existing biology rather than against it, protecting rather than disrupting, adding rather than depleting, produces not just better harvests, but a fundamentally different experience of what it means to grow food. Less labor, less costs, less dependence on supply chains and product availability and corporate pricing decisions, more connection to the actual living system you are participating in rather than managing from the outside. This is not a small distinction. In a world where the average item of food travels 1,500 kilometers between production and consumption, where the vegetables in a supermarket have frequently lost 40% of their nutritional content in transit and storage, where the disconnect between people and the biological origins of their food has become so complete that surveys consistently find significant percentages of children who cannot identify common vegetables in their unprocessed form. In that world, the ability to walk into your garden and lift a layer of straw and find food that you grew from a sprouting kitchen potato at zero additional cost is not a hobby. It is a form of sovereignty. Charles Dowding, whose decade of side-by-side trials we discussed earlier, has said in interviews that the most significant thing he has observed over 40 years of no-dig gardening is not the yield data, though the yield data is compelling. It is the shift in how people relate to their gardens once they stop fighting them. The anxiety that characterizes conventional growing, the constant monitoring for deficiency symptoms, the worry about whether the fertilizer schedule is correct, the sense that the garden is a problem to be managed rather than a system to be participated in. That anxiety largely dissolves when the biological foundation of the soil is healthy and intact and self-regulating. The garden becomes, in a word that Dowding uses without embarrassment, enjoyable. Not in spite of the reduced intervention, but because of it. Ruth Stout knew this at 61, standing in Connecticut with a bag of seed potatoes and no plowman, and nothing to lose by trying something that made intuitive sense, even if it made no conventional sense whatsoever. She knew it at 70, when gardening without work was making its quiet, unsponsored way through the hands of readers who could not believe nobody had told them this before. She knew it at 96, still in her garden, still under her hay, still feeding herself from ground that had been improving continuously for 50 years without a single application of anything that came in a bag with a brand name on it. She did not live to see the mycorrhizal research. She did not know about the University of Reading study or Charles Dowding's controlled trials or the global no-dig movement that would eventually carry her ideas to gardeners on 6 continents via platforms she could not have imagined. But she would not have been surprised by any of it. She would have read it with the satisfied expression of someone who has been told by a scientist that the thing they have been doing correctly for half a century is, in fact, correct. And then she would have gone back outside. Here is what I want you to take from this, and it is the most important thing in this entire video. More important than the straw depth and the stolen biology and the mycorrhizal networks and all of it. You do not need permission to do this. You do not need a certification or a course or an expensive starter kit or a garden that is already in good condition or soil that has already been amended or a property with ideal growing conditions or any of the prerequisites that the conventional gardening industry implicitly suggests are necessary before you are qualified to begin. You need a patch of ground that receives 6 hours of sunlight. You need seed potatoes. You need straw. And you need the willingness to do something that looks to anyone walking past like almost nothing at all. Place some sprouting potatoes on the ground, cover them deeply, and walk away. Ruth Stout was 61 and had never seriously gardened before and was annoyed about a plowman and had no scientific framework for what she was doing and no guarantee that it would work and no audience waiting to validate the attempt. She did it anyway, and the ground rewarded her for 50 years. The question is not whether this method works. The science has answered that. The history has answered that. The 10,000 backyard gardens currently running on permanent mulch systems across the world have answered that in the most practical and unrepeatable terms available. Actual food, actual soil, actual results measured in the most honest currency there is, which is whether the people doing it are still doing it 5 years later. The question is only whether you are going to begin. If you have made it to this point in the video, you already know something that the majority of people who will walk into a garden center this weekend do not know. You know what a stolon is and why it does not need deep soil to develop. You know what mycorrhizal networks are and what happens to them every time a tiller blade passes through healthy ground. You know that the $197 billion fertilizer industry and the $12 billion garden tool industry and the $84 billion pesticide market are not providing solutions to problems that exist independently of their products. They are, in significant part, providing solutions to problems that their products create. And you know that a woman in Connecticut figured all of this out in 1945 with a bag of potatoes and a pile of straw and an absent plowman, and that the ground she tended for 50 years without a single synthetic input became, by every biological measure available, more productive and more alive with each passing season. That is not a small amount of knowledge to carry out of a single video, and knowledge, as Ruth Stout understood better than almost anyone, is only as valuable as what you do with it. So here is what I am asking you to do. Not for this channel, not for an algorithm, for yourself and for the people you are going to tell about this, because the single most reliable way that Ruth Stout's ideas survived 70 years of institutional silence was through exactly that mechanism. One person telling another person in a kitchen or a community garden or a letter passed between neighbors that there was a different way and it actually worked. Find a patch of ground. It does not need to be large. 2 square meters is enough to run a genuine first-season experiment that will tell you more than any video can. Source your straw, call a local farm, check agricultural classifieds, ask at a feed store. Get your seed potatoes chitting on a windowsill. And when the last frost date passes in your area, go outside, place those potatoes on the uncleared ground, cover them to 40 centimeters, water once, and then do the thing that every instinct of conventional gardening will tell you is irresponsible. Walk away. Come back in 100 days and lift the straw. If you want to share what you find, and I genuinely hope you will, because the most compelling evidence for this method is not a peer-reviewed study, it is a photograph of clean potatoes lying on undisturbed ground, taken by someone who could not quite believe what they were looking at. Leave it in the comments. Show people what the ground under your mulch looked like when you lifted it. Show them the earthworms. Show them the dark, loose soil that nobody tilled and nobody fertilized and nobody amended with anything that came in a bag. That evidence, multiplying across comment sections and community gardens and kitchen conversations, is worth more than any advertising budget. If this video gave you something real, not entertainment, but an actual shift in how you understand the relationship between soil and the systems that profit from keeping you dependent on them, then share it with one person who gardens, not to grow this channel, but to grow the conversation. Every person who learns what mycorrhizal networks are and what tillage does to them is a person who will make different decisions in their garden, spend less money on inputs that undermine the biology they are paying for, and produce food from ground that improves rather than depletes with each passing season. Subscribe if you want to continue this conversation, and I want to be direct about what subscribing here actually means. It is not a gesture of support for a content creator. It is a signal to the platforms that decide which information reaches people and which disappears into algorithmic irrelevance, that this category of knowledge has an audience that will not be satisfied with sponsored content about the best new fertilizer formulations. Every subscription is a vote for the proposition that people deserve access to the agricultural knowledge that corporations have every financial incentive to keep obscure. They have $300 billion. We have this. And next week, we are going underground in a very different sense. Back 3,000 years to a civilization that figured out how to grow abundant food in the middle of open water on floating islands made entirely from lake sediment and aquatic vegetation, with zero soil amendment and zero irrigation in yields that astonished the Spanish conquistadors who encountered them and have astonished agronomists ever since. The Aztec Chinampa system was dismissed for centuries as a primitive curiosity. NASA is currently studying it as a potential food production model for long-duration space missions. The reason it works is the same reason Ruth Stout's straw beds work. And once you see the connection, you will understand something about soil biology that most professional agronomists have still not fully integrated into their practice. That video goes up next week. Make sure you are there for it.